I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'll talk about a new mechanism design problem that I find technically fascinating, essentially transaction fee mechanism. I'll tell you some new results that I'm excited about. This is joint work with my student Hao Chang. So what's a transaction fee mechanism? If you are attending this conference, you cannot be unfamiliar with the transaction fee mechanism, right? So basically, the space on the blockchain is a precious resource, and often the users would have to compete to get their transactions confirmed. In this case, we need to run a so-called transaction fee mechanism. So for example, Bitcoin today deploys a simple first price auction. Suppose the block size is K. Essentially, the K highest bids are confirmed, and everyone pays their own bid. All the payment goes to the miner. And as we learn from classical algorithmic game theory, a first price auction isn't a great auction. It incentivizes users to bid untruthfully. For example, it may be in the user's best interest to bid just barely enough to be among the top K, right? So basically the user can get confirmed while paying the least amount. What's fascinating about the transaction fee mechanism is that other classical mechanisms fail to work. For example, in classical mechanism design, second price auction is like a golden standard. So why can't we use second price auction here? So here we have a blockchain, right? So if the block size is K, second price auction actually becomes K plus first price auction. In this case, the block size is 4. So the top 4 bids get confirmed and they pay the 5th price. And what's wrong with this? So here's a way that the miner can cheat and benefit itself. It can inject a fake transaction that's priced at 5. And in this way, everyone would end up paying 5 instead of 3, right? So then the miner could benefit. More generally, the issue is that in classical mechanism design, we typically assume that the auctioneer is fully trusted, and we care about designing mechanisms that incentivize the users to bid truthfully. But in this new decentralized environment, even the miner may have incentive to cheat and not implement the honest mechanism faithfully. So this is why the classical mechanisms aren't a great fit. Okay, so recently, actually, Elaine work looked into how to design a dream transaction fee mechanism. So most of these works agree on a set of desiderata. So let me explain them one by one, right? So the first requirement is that the mechanism must be user incentive compatible, or UIC for short. This basically says that any individual user's best strategy should be to bid truthfully. And this notion is like essentially the same as the classical notion of incentive compatibility, in classical mechanism design. We also want miner incentive compatibility, or MIC for short. Specifically, it should be the case that the miner doesn't have incentive to cheat. Like, its best strategy is just to play by the book and implement the honest mechanism faithfully. Okay, and then last but not the least, in the blockchain environment, it's actually quite easy for players to form binding side contracts. In particular, imagine we have Ethereum, then the players can simply use smart contracts as an enforcement mechanism, so they can split off their joint gains. So we also want a third property called side contract proofness, or SCP for short. In particular, suppose the miner forms a coalition with up to C users, and the coalition is aiming to maximize their joint utility. In this case, the coalition's best response is to behave honestly and truthfully, and deviating should not bring them any benefit. So by the way, if you have any questions, why don't you type them into the chat? I'll periodically check if there are questions in the chat. Okay, so among these three properties, the last two arise in this new decentralized environment. And these are the new challenges that we face. And these are the new challenges that make transaction fee mechanism depart from classical mechanism design. What's interesting is that, although the past works, they kind of agree on the set of desiderata, and none of the existing works can achieve all these three properties at the same time. And therefore, in a recent work by Tim Roughgarden, he actually phrased an important open question: can we have such a dream transaction fee mechanism one that satisfies all of the three properties? So as I said, actually none of the existing mechanisms is ideal, but the closest we have come to in terms of like having all these three properties is actually Ethereum's EIP 1559. And this mechanism was actually rolled out just a couple of months ago. Okay, so actually for the purpose of this talk, it's not too important to understand EIP 1559, but just for your curiosity, I will mention about it at a very high level, right? Tim Roughgarden actually proved, interestingly, that if the block size is infinite, meaning there's no congestion, then EIP 1559 actually indeed satisfies all three properties at the same time. But of course, in the real world, the block size is not infinite, and congestions can occur every now and then. And in this case, when the block size is finite and congestions can take place, we still don't have any dream transaction fee mechanism. Okay, so at a very high level, EIP 1559 gracefully switches between two modes of operation. So when things are congested, it approximates a first price auction. And as I said, first price auctions aren't awesome auctions. And when things are uncongested, and then the mechanism approximates a simple posted price auction. So this is a simple auction where there's a take it or leave it offer that's fixed. And if your bid is higher than this posted price, you get confirmed and you pay the posted price. Otherwise, you're not confirmed. And what's also interesting is that all of the payment is actually not paid to the miner. All of the payment is burnt on the blockchain. The miner gets nothing. So you may be worried, in this case, why would miners still be incentivized to mine? The miners are still getting a block reward. Like even before Ethereum's 1559, most of the revenue is coming from the block reward anyway. This block reward is like a constant, like it doesn't actually matter to the game theoretic analysis. So that's why we kind of ignore it in the model. And you may find this burn rule interesting, and I'll come back to it later. This is not something that we see in classical mechanisms. And later on, I'll show, perhaps this game burn rule is actually giving us more power in transaction fee mechanisms. Okay. So I'll tell you our results at a high level, and then I'll dive into the technical details. Okay. So the first obvious question, you may wonder why, despite the community's efforts, we still don't have a dream mechanism. Is there a fundamental barrier? And we show that indeed, assuming finite block size, it's impossible to satisfy all three properties at the same time. This lower bound holds not only for deterministic mechanisms, but also for randomized mechanisms as well. And this may seem to, paint a pessimistic view. And we want to ask, okay, are there any ways we can circumvent this impossibility? And we show that the current modeling techniques may be a little too draconian in some sense. And there are potential ways to relax the incentive compatibility notion to get around this impossibility. And finally, our work also, we are able to theoretically explain why some of these new elements are necessary in this new type of mechanism design. For instance, the burn rule, right? Like these are the elements that don't show up in classical mechanisms. And we can show like, they indeed bring us more power here. Okay, so let's now go into the technical details. First, I want to go over the modeling for transaction fee mechanism because this is a new problem. So it's helpful to go over the abstraction and the incentive compatibility definitions. And then I'll go over the impossibility proof. At the end, I'll discuss the new relaxed notion of incentive compatibility and maybe show some hope that perhaps these impossibilities aren't necessarily the end of the world. Any questions at this point? Okay. So first, let's quickly go over what's a transaction fee mechanism, and now just a little bit more formally. Okay, so the transaction fee mechanism is run every time a block is confirmed. So for simplicity, like the prior works, we will consider a single instance of this auction. Imagine first the users post their bids, and this is the maximum amount they are willing to pay to get their transactions confirmed. And because each user's bid contains a single parameter, sometimes you also hear this term single parameter environment. So this is called a single parameter environment. Okay, so next, the miner will look at the outstanding bids or the outstanding transactions and decide which ones to include in the block. And this rule needs to be specified by the mechanism. It's called the inclusion rule. For example, imagine we are running the second price auction, right? Like I said, the second price auction isn't great here, but it still works as an example. In this case, the miner just includes the highest bids in the block. Once the bids are included, then the blockchain executes the confirmation rule and the payment rule to decide which of the included bids are confirmed and how much they should pay. In the case of a second price auction, every confirmed user should pay the price of the first unconfirmed transaction, right? In this case, it's 5. And what's interesting here is that, so in the more general case, actually, not all included transactions are necessarily confirmed. Like for instance, in this example, the bid 5 is just there to set the price. And it's actually not confirmed, even though it's included in the block. And this is necessary because the blockchain needs to know how much each confirmed user is paying, and how much revenue to pay to the miner. And the blockchain cannot read any state outside the blockchain. Like it cannot read any transient network state. Okay. And the confirmation rule and the payment rule, like I said, they're implemented by the blockchain. And usually we trust the blockchain, right? So although the miner is actually executing, remember, there's the inclusion rule, and that's executed by the miner. And the miner can cheat, like it can pick an arbitrary set of transactions to include, and it doesn't have to follow the honest rules. Like the miner can even inject fake transactions, as I said in the beginning. Okay, so finally, there's an extra rule called the miner revenue rule, and that decides how much of the total payment goes to the miner. So what's interesting here is like not all of the payment must go to the miner, but we may assume that the miner revenue is at most the total user payment. So part or all of it can be burnt, right? Like in the case of Ethereum 1559, in the uncongested regime, like I said, like all the payment is essentially burnt. Okay, so this is a new element in transaction fee mechanism. And before I tell you the impossibility, let's just quickly go over the utility definition, right? So this is kind of like the most natural notion for utility. Imagine every user has some true value if its transaction is confirmed. So the user's utility is the true value minus the payment amount if the transaction is confirmed. And if the transaction is not confirmed, obviously the utility is 0. And the miner's utility is simply the revenue it's making. Okay, so I'm going to be assuming these utility notions throughout the impossibility proof. And let me see if there are any questions. If there are no questions at this point, I'm going to try to prove this impossibility to you. Okay, so we want to prove that if the block size is finite, then no non-trivial transaction fee mechanism can satisfy all three properties at the same time. And the impossibility, like I said, holds for both deterministic and randomized mechanisms. But in this talk, I'm going to just go through the deterministic case. The proof for the randomized case is actually technically more sophisticated. So again, this is the statement we want to prove. Assume the block size is finite, and then no non-trivial transaction fee mechanism can satisfy both UIC and one SCP at the same time. So essentially in the proof, I'm going to kind of try to understand what are the requirements of UIC, what are the requirements of one SCP, and I will show that these requirements actually contradict each other. And you may have noticed that in this impossibility, there are three properties, but I actually only need two of them to get this impossibility. Like this makes the impossibility even stronger. And as for SCP, like remember there's a parameter C, so one SCP means the miner can collude with at most one user. And the impossibility holds even when the miner colludes with at most one user, and this also makes the impossibility stronger. Okay. So as I said, I'm going to try to understand the requirements of UIC and one SCP and show that they contradict each other. So first, what are the requirements imposed by UIC? And this is answered by Meyerson's lemma. And this is like, one of the most famous lemmas in mechanism design. And Roger Meyerson, he actually won Nobel Prize for his contributions to mechanism design and auction theory. Okay, so at a high level, if we want an auction that incentivizes the users to bid truthfully, then Meyerson's lemma gives a complete characterization of the solution space. Okay, and then it implies that in order for us to guarantee UIC, first, the inclusion and confirmation rule must be monotone. And what does this mean? So suppose, let's just suppose the miner is honestly implementing the mechanism now, right? If my bid is currently confirmed and I raise my bid, then it should still be confirmed. Like it's not going to be the case that raising my bid is going to flip me from confirmed to unconfirmed. And the converse is true as well. Like if currently my bid is not confirmed, and if I lower my bid, it should still be unconfirmed, assuming everyone else's bids don't change. Okay, so that's a very natural notion, monotone. And second, Meyerson's lemma says if the mechanism is UIC, then the payment rule must be unique once the inclusion and confirmation rules are specified. Specifically, how much should every confirmed user pay? They should be paying the minimum price it could have bid and still remain confirmed. Like in other words, you can imagine there's a confirmed user, it's bidding something, and let's now try to lower its bid little by little. And at some point, you'll hit a critical point at which the user will switch from confirmed to unconfirmed. And this is the price the user should be paying. And obviously, if the user's transaction is not confirmed, then it just pays zero. So by the way, Meyerson's lemma also has a reverse direction, and I don't state it here because we only need this direction for the lower bound. Okay. So again, we want to prove if the block size is finite, then no non-trivial transaction fee mechanism can satisfy UIC and one SCP at the same time. And the key step in the proof is to prove this following this important Keylemma. And this Keylemma says any transaction fee mechanism that is both UIC and one SCP must always have zero miner revenue. The miner must always earn zero. And in fact, this Keylemma actually holds no matter whether the block size is finite or infinite. So our plan is to first prove this Keylemma, and then we will then throw in the finite block size assumption to get our final impossibility. I also want to say that this Keylemma is actually of independent interest. As I said, this Keylemma holds even when the block size is infinite. And this kind of is like saying it's kind of interesting because it says that EIP 1559's Bern rule turns out to be necessary, right? Remember, 1559 can achieve all three properties when the block size is infinite, and it adopts this Bern rule, and everything gets burned, the miner gets nothing. And this lemma is saying this is actually necessary, even if you want to achieve all these properties under infinite block size. Okay, so how do we prove something like this? We are going to prove by contradiction, right? So suppose, for the sake of contradiction, there is indeed a non-trivial, suppose there is indeed a non-trivial transaction fee mechanism with positive miner revenue, and it satisfies both the UIC and one SCP, and we want to reach a contradiction. Okay, so by our assumption, right, this mechanism, must with some bit, the mechanism must have positive miner revenue. And let's imagine the bit is B1 to Bn. So when the world consists of this bit vector, then the miner will earn a positive amount. And our proof strategy is the following. So we will take each user one by one and lower its bit to 0. And as we do that, we will argue the miner's revenue should not change. And notice that this is already sufficient for us to reach a contradiction, right? And because we can simply essentially lower each user's bit to 0 one by one. And at the end of the day, everyone's bidding 0. And because the miner's revenue is preserved in the process, the miner is still getting positive revenue. And this is impossible because we said the miner revenue has to be upper bounded by the user payment, right? If everyone's bidding 0, then everyone's paying 0, then the miner cannot be getting positive revenue. Okay. Okay, so I only have to prove, let's say, take one of the users without loss of generality, B1, and I'm going to lower B1 to 0, and I just have to convince you that the miner's revenue should be unaffected in this process. Okay, so to prove this, we will consider two cases. Case one is when initially this user, its bit B1 is actually not confirmed. Also, by the way, throughout this proof, I'm going to assume the rest of the world stays the same. Like that is the bits B2 to Bn are fixed. Okay, so initially B1 is not confirmed, and now we are lowering it to 0. And I want to argue the miner's revenue or miner utility should not increase or decrease by the requirement of one SCP. And in particular, I'm going to prove one direction, and because the other direction is symmetric, I'll prove that the miner's utility should not decrease in this process. Okay, so suppose this is not true. The miner's utility actually decreases by delta, a positive amount as we change from B1 to 0. And then I'm going to argue that there is like a coalition strategy that allows us to break one SCP, and this gives us a contradiction, right? So how do you break one SCP? So imagine, so the first thing to observe is like, because the mechanism is monotone and initially B1 is not confirmed, like as you go from B1 to 0, the user is not going to get confirmed anyhow. So the user's utility is always 0. And it's like, from the user's perspective, it's like indifferent to bidding either B1 or 0. So imagine that the user's actual true value is 0. And the user itself is indifferent to bidding B1 or 0, but it can form a coalition with the miner. Right? And let's consider the coalition's best strategy. The coalition is actually better off for the user to bid B1, because in that case, the miner's revenue increases by delta. So essentially, this says if the user colludes with the miner, right, there is a case that the user and the miner, the coalition, are better off if the user doesn't bid truthfully. And this violates one SCP. And it allows us to conclude that when you lower the bid from B1 to 0, the miner's utility should not decrease. And then we can essentially prove the other direction using a symmetric argument. Like I can also similarly argue the miner's utility should not increase as we lower user one's bid from B1 to 0. Okay, so that's case 1. And now let's look at case 2, which is a little more interesting. So this is the case when initially B1's bid is confirmed. And then we lower it to 0. And similarly, just like before, I want to argue the miner's revenue is unaffected in this process. And again, there are 2 directions. I want to argue the miner's revenue should not decrease and it should not increase. So let's first try to argue that it should not decrease. Okay, so to argue this, I will actually consider divided into 3 steps. So I'm lowering from B1 to 0, but I can imagine first I lower from B1 to P1, where P1 is the user's actual payment price, right? So initially B1 is confirmed and the user must be paying something, right? And I'm going to call that price P1. And in step 2, I'm going to lower the bid from P1 to just a little less than P1. So P1 minus epsilon, and epsilon is arbitrarily small. And then in the 3rd step, I'm going to lower from P1 minus epsilon all the way to 0. So I just have to argue that in each step, the miner's revenue is unaffected. So let's take the first step, and we can show that the miner's utility should not decrease by the requirements of one SCP. And the proof is actually pretty similar to the one we have seen before, but let me just do it again. Suppose the miner's utility does decrease by delta in this process. And so like by Meyerson's lemma, when you lower from B1 to P1, you are going to just be confirmed anyhow. So the user is actually indifferent to bidding B1 or P1, right? Because its utility is always V1 minus P1, where V1 is the user's true value. Essentially, there's a way for the user to collude with the miner, and in some situation, the coalition is better off if the user doesn't bid truthfully, which violates one SCP, right? So imagine if the user's actual value is actually P1. And now the user itself is indifferent to bidding B1 or P1, but when the user and the miner form a coalition, the coalition actually is better off if the user bids B1 instead, because then the miner's revenue is increasing by delta. And this violates one SCP. So this is like essentially a similar proof we have seen for case 1. And I'm going to argue that, for the bottom region, the argument is similar. So I won't go into the details here. And the key observation is like when you lower from P1 minus epsilon to 0, the confirmation decision is unaffected. And therefore you can apply the same kind of logic. So what's most interesting is the middle region. As you lower from P1 to P1 minus epsilon, and here it's more interesting because the confirmation decision is changing as you lower from P1 to P1 minus epsilon. So remember, I've argued that in the top region and in the bottom region, the miner's utility is unaffected. Like basically between B1 and P1 and between P1 minus epsilon and 0, the miner's utility doesn't change. So if actually it makes any difference to the miner at all, whether the user is bidding B1 or 0, then that entire difference must occur as a sudden jump at this point P1. Okay. And we want to prove that this is impossible. Essentially, there cannot be a sudden jump in the miner's utility as you lower from P1 to just like a tiny little bit below P1. There's a message, hold on. Okay. Okay, so how do we argue this, right? This is a little more interesting. Okay. So suppose the miner's utility decreases by delta in this process. So let's imagine a scenario in which the user's actual value is P1 minus epsilon. So if it were to bid truthfully, it would be bidding P1 minus epsilon. But in this case, if the user forms a coalition with the miner, then the coalition is better off if the user bids P1 instead. And why is this the case? We can do the calculation a little bit more carefully here. So if the user bids P1 instead, the user is actually losing by epsilon amount because it's like paying P1, but its actual value is P1 minus epsilon, right? So it has negative epsilon utility. However, the miner's utility is going to increase by delta. And the delta is going to outweigh the epsilon because, as I said, the epsilon can be made arbitrarily small. So in this case, even though this coalition strategy is just hurting the user a little bit, that's compensated by, the much greater benefit for the miner. And therefore, the coalition is better off if the user doesn't bid truthfully. And thus, we can also show, a violation of 1 SCP. Okay. So similarly, we can also show the miner's utility should not increase. And the argument for this is actually a little simpler. Like if the user's actual value is P1, then it should bid P1 minus epsilon. In this case, actually, the user's utility is just 0, no matter whether it bids P1 or P1 minus epsilon. But the miner is doing better if the user bids P1 minus epsilon. So like we rule out both the decrease and increase, essentially. Okay. So now just to recap, right, like I've shown you that in all of these 3 steps, as I lower, right, lower, the miner's revenue is unaffected. And as I said in the beginning, this shows that any transaction fee mechanism that is both UIC and 1 SCP must always have 0 miner revenue. Okay. So we now have this Keylemma, and essentially this Keylemma is imposing some strong requirements on the mechanism. It's saying that if you want the mechanism to satisfy both UIC and 1 SCP, not only must the mechanism satisfy the conditions imposed by Meyerson's lemma, it must also be the case that all of the user's payment is burnt entirely and the miner always gets nothing. Next, we are going to prove the actual impossibility. And our plan is to throw in yet another requirement, right? So far we haven't used any assumption on the block size yet. And now I want to argue if not only do you want UIC and 1 SCP, you also want to make sure the mechanism works for finite block size. Then it's like essentially hopeless and you get your impossibility. Okay, so the proof again is by contradiction. Suppose that indeed exists a non-trivial transaction fee mechanism that is both UIC and 1 SCP, assuming finite block size. Okay. because the mechanism is non-trivial, there must exist a bit vector that ends up with positive pay, like from some user. So let's say the bit vector is B1 to Bn, and when the world has this bit vector, some user is going to pay a positive amount, and let's call that user Bj. Okay, so now imagine an alternative world in which the bit vector consists of the following. So we still have B1 to Bn, but in this case, we have many other users whose true value is actually Bj plus some tiny amount epsilon. So let's say like these bits reflect everyone's true value. And in particular, there are more people whose true value is Bj plus epsilon than the block can hold. And this means that one of these Bj plus epsilon bidders, and let's call that bidder U, and it cannot be like all of them get confirmed, right? Because the block doesn't have so much space. So one of them must be left out. And let's say U is left out. So in this case, I claim you can actually collude with the miner, and the coalition is better off if they cheat. So essentially, imagine the user U colludes with the miner, and instead of bidding its true value Bj plus epsilon, it bids Bj instead. And the miner will then make a block comprised of B1 to Bn, and for the Bj location, it's going to put in user U's bid. So as you can see, in this case, user U is going to get confirmed. Sorry, I guess like by I wrote the miner includes B1 to Bn. I actually mean the miner will pretend the world consists of only bits B1 to Bn, and the Bj position is replaced with user U's bit, and then it's going to run the honest mechanism, and the honest mechanism will decide to put whatever bit in the block. But as we said earlier, if the world consists of B1 to Bn, and then Bj will be confirmed, right? So user U's bit will be confirmed, and it's paying at most Bj. So the user U now has positive utility, and the miner is just indifferent anyhow, because the miner always gets 0. And therefore, the coalition is better off if they cheat. And this allows us to reach a contradiction, and therefore we get this final impossibility. Okay, so that's the impossibility result for the deterministic case. In our paper, we also extend the proof to work for randomized mechanisms as well. The proof for the randomized case is more technically involved, and I won't go into details here. Okay. Instead, I want to have some more philosophical discussions. So this impossibility result seems to paint a rather pessimistic view. Is there any way we can potentially hope to get around this impossibility? I will describe a relaxed notion of incentive compatibility and show that under this relaxed notion, there is something we can do. I want to say the notion and the scheme I'm going to propose, like, I don't know that they're like the final solution we want, but nonetheless, it's a first step, and I hope it's like thought-provoking. And in particular, I'm hoping to show that the current modeling techniques might be too draconian, and we should really rethink what the right model is. So what's the key observation? So far, we've assumed that the auction is one shot, and the players are myopic, and they only care about the outcome of the present auction instance. And this is also the same approach adopted by prior works. So what bothers me about this model is the following. Suppose I inject a fake transaction, or I overbid, meaning I bid higher than my true value. So if my offending transaction is not confirmed in the present, then I don't have to pay anything in the present, right? So such cheating is actually free if you only consider one instance. But if you think about it a little bit more, the transaction fee mechanism will go on, right? You're confirming block after block, And once I post the transaction to the network, I cannot retract it back, like it's forever there. Okay. So it could be the case that for this offending transaction, even though it's not confirmed in the present and I'm not paying anything in the present, it could be it gets picked up and confirmed in a later block, and I may end up paying something anyway in the future. Okay, so the current model just fails to capture this cost. And then a natural question is like, if we change the model and we more accurately charge for this implicit cost of cheating, can we get around this impossibility? This question is a little challenging to answer, partly because it's like very hard to predict how much these offending transactions will be paying in the future when they do get picked up and confirmed by a future block. Because the actual payment actually depends on the environment, right? It depends on how much other users are bidding. It depends on the transaction fee mechanism itself too. So I don't know how to characterize the cost of such cheating, but maybe we can take a first step and modify the question a little bit. You know, we can ask, what is the worst case or the harshest cost for the offender? Which is in some sense the best case for the mechanism designer. So we can ask, you know, in this case, can we overcome this impossibility, right? This is a meaningful question to ask because it'll help us decide whether, you know, exploring this entire direction is worth exploring this whole direction, right? So what's the worst case for the offender? In the worst case, we can assume that the offender will end up paying the full bid amount sometime in the future. I mean, of course, it doesn't have to be the case in practice because, you know, depends on the mechanism, depends on other transactions. But nonetheless, let's assume the worst case, and we can calculate the cost of cheating based on this pessimistic assumption. So what's the cost of cheating? If you overbid and your transaction is not confirmed in the present, then your cost is then the bid minus the true value. This is assuming you are paying the full bid in the future. If you inject a fake transaction and it's not confirmed right now, then the cost is simply the full bid amount because a fake transaction has a true value of 0. So another way to look at this is like, you know, maybe we have a really paranoid player and it really doesn't want to deviate as long as there is potentially, you know, if there is any chance at all of losing out, it doesn't want to deviate. And then, you know, we are asking, is there a mechanism that can defend against cheating from like these really paranoid players? Okay. And interestingly, we show that under this new and more refined utility model, there is actually a rather cute mechanism that can satisfy UIC, MIC, and one SCP at the same time, right? That's getting around this impossibility. And we call this the burning second price auction. And the way it works is the following. In this case, the block size is 6. The top 6 transactions are included in the block. Among them, the top 3 are confirmed and they all pay the 4th price, right? So from the user's perspective, it's still like a second price auction. But what's interesting is the miner revenue. The miner's revenue is the sum of the unconfirmed transactions included in the block. So in this case, it's sum of 8, 6, and 5. Also in this example, we have 3 confirmed and 3 unconfirmed in the block. And that doesn't have to be the case. Like it can be 4 confirmed and 2 unconfirmed. But we do need to make sure the number of confirmed transactions in the block is at least as many as the unconfirmed transactions in the block. And this is required to make sure the miner revenue does not exceed the total payment. Okay. So maybe just to help you get some intuition, this is by no means a formal proof. Like, why does this work? We can look at one particular case of cheating, right? So let's say the miner colludes with the user and he colludes with Shafi, and Shafi will bid higher. Instead of bidding her true value 8, it will bid 9 instead. And the hope is, you know, the miner maybe can earn more, right? So indeed, if Shafi bids 9, the miner will earn 1 more. But on the other hand, there is actually a cost for Shafi to do that. And as I said in the utility definition, right, you know, in the worst case, Shafi will end up paying 9 in the future. And because her true value is 8, she's losing out by 1 in the worst case. So overall, the coalition doesn't gain anything by such cheating. And again, this is not a proof, because in the actual proof, you have to exhaust all possible ways of cheating. And that's what we did in the paper. Like we go over all cases and we show like in all cases of cheating, as long as the miner is colluding with at most one user, then it doesn't help. Okay. So another interesting observation, like I'm not going to prove this, but in this burning second price auction, it makes use of the fact that some transactions in the block, they're not confirmed, they're just there to set the price. And it turns out this is actually useful. Like there's actually some debate in the community whether we should allow unconfirmed transactions in the block, right? The argument against it is like the space is precious, like you probably don't want unconfirmed transactions there for that reason. But we can show even with the new utility function, if the blocks do not allow unconfirmed transactions, then the impossibility would still hold. So this ability is helping us in some manner. Okay, just to summarize, I hope I've convinced you that transaction fee mechanism design is a technically fascinating problem, partly because all the classical mechanisms don't work. So our work takes a step forward in understanding transaction fee mechanism. As I said, this is by no means the final solution. There's a lot of details, like the detailed proofs, I didn't cover in this talk, so please refer to our paper. And essentially, I think there are lots of open questions in this space, and some of them are actually laid out in this elegant paper by Tim Roughgarden. Like he has a list of open questions at the end of the paper. Like for instance, how can you model the repeated nature of the auctions and longer scale strategies? What about considering relaxed notions that allow us to circumvent other relaxed notions that allow us to circumvent this kind of impossibility? Can we use crypto to help the design and so on and so forth? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elaine. I already see a question in Q&A by Barnaibe Monod. So they ask, if unconfirmed but included transactions pay the miner who includes them, then do these users have to pay their bid again when they're included and confirmed in a later block?
Oh, I guess I didn't know that was confusing. So the unconfirmed users, they're paying nothing. And the confirmed users are paying 8. And then like in this case, the total payment is 12 plus 11 plus 9, and the miner gets 8 plus 6 plus 5, right? So the miner's revenue is less than the total payment. So the unconfirmed users don't have to pay in the present, like they just pay later whenever they're actually confirmed. But we still include their transactions in the block to set the price, like to set how much confirmed users are paying and to set the miner revenue.
All right, so if there are more questions for Elaine, please post them on the chat box or the Q&A. So I had a question as well. So, so in practice, how would the collusion between the cheating user and the miner would happen if you don't know ahead of time who the miner for a specific block would be?
In practice, yeah, that's a very good question. In practice, it's actually fairly easy to form such coalition just because like, the bigger players, the bigger miners aren't that many, right? So we know who are the bigger players. And if they just put out a smart contract, like post it on the blockchain, then you can easily, like the blockchain itself can provide a rendezvous mechanism for such coalition to take place.
All right. I see one more question in Q&A.
Yes.
It might be helpful for you to read it directly.
Yeah, so the question is a little long. Maybe I should read it first. Decentralized finance changes users' utility. They no longer care about whether they can get confirmed on the blockchain or not, but rather which position they could get confirmed. That is, a bidder's utility is contingent on his position on chain, as well as what orders are executed before his orders. For example, if a user wants to trade at a decentralized exchange, he may prefer to trade before another trade, which may have a large impact on the price, like front running, if the valuation of the bidder is contingent on the position, the incentive compatibility problem for users become much more complicated. That the collusion is also more complicated. What results will still be true and what will not be? So that's a very interesting question. Like, I guess the current model, we don't take this into account. So I don't know the answer, but I think it's like a potentially a really interesting question. This will probably you'll need to change the underlying abstraction at the model for the auction. Thank you. Yeah.
All right, we still have time for questions if there are any more. All right, so if there are no more questions, please join me to thank Elaine for the fascinating talk. We're taking a short break and getting back in a few minutes.